The badge still worked, the parking spot was the same, and the paycheck landed every other Friday without drama. The building smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, the same mix it had for years. The lights came on automatically at 7, and the hallway filled with the low sound of people settling into another day that would not surprise anyone. It felt orderly, responsible, calm. It felt like something that could be relied on. There had been changes, but none that forced a reset. A new manager arrived once, then left. Software updates came and went. Desks were rearranged to make space for a different team. The work itself stayed familiar enough to do without thinking too hard about it. That familiarity carried a kind of relief. It reduced friction. It left room for the rest of life to happen without too much spillover. Health insurance was the reason most often given, sometimes out loud, sometimes silently. The plan had been decent when it started and remained decent as years passed. Not remarkable, not generous, but predictable. Doctor visits stayed affordable. Prescriptions stayed manageable. When a child was born, the hospital bills arrived already filtered through the plan, softened into something that could be paid without panic. The coverage worked in the background, quietly removing one category of worry. The job also came with a schedule that made sense for a household. Mornings could start early enough to get kids out the door. Evenings ended in time to make dinner without rushing. Vacation days accrued steadily, and using them did not require explanation beyond a calendar entry. Sick days were accepted without suspicion. That acceptance mattered more than it seemed at first. It meant illness did not have to be negotiated. At home, conversations about money were calm. Bills were paid on time. The mortgage draft cleared every month. The checking account balance dipped and rose in familiar patterns. There was no sense of sliding backward. There was no fear of missing a payment. The household operated inside a narrow but stable range, and stability became the dominant value without ever being named as such. Friends from earlier years moved on to other companies. Some went into different fields entirely. Their paths became harder to follow. Titles changed, salaries rose in uneven jumps. Their schedules became less predictable. They talked about pressure, about deadlines that moved, about benefits that required closer attention. Listening to them reinforced the idea that staying put had been a sensible choice. Raises came occasionally, usually after reviews that described reliability and consistency. The increases were modest but regular. They fit easily into the existing budget without requiring any changes. Nothing new had to be learned to absorb them. The household did not expand its spending much. The extra money mostly filled in gaps that had always been there, making things smoother rather than different. Years passed in this way, measured more by family events than by work milestones. A child started school. Another learned to ride a bike. The house needed a new roof, then a new water heater. The job continued to provide coverage for the dentist and the pediatrician. That coverage felt like a floor that could not drop away. There were moments when other possibilities surfaced. A recruiter called once with an opportunity that sounded interesting. The salary was higher. The role came with more responsibility. The benefits were less clear. The conversation ended politely, with no follow-up. It did not feel like a decision so much as a return to the known. At the office, newer hires arrived with energy and expectations that felt foreign. They asked questions about advancement timelines. They talked about learning opportunities. They left after a few years for roles elsewhere. Their exits were noted but not deeply felt. The work continued. The systems absorbed their absence. The health insurance plan changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Deductibles increased. Copays rose by small increments. Coverage narrowed around certain services. None of these changes triggered alarm. They were accepted as part of the broader landscape, like inflation or traffic. The job still offered something others did not, and that comparison kept it in place. Over time, the work itself became less visible. Tasks were completed efficiently, often without recognition. That efficiency was valued, but it did not translate into expansion. The role remained defined by its boundaries. Those boundaries were comfortable. they also stayed fixed. At home, the children grew older, their needs shifted, activities became more expensive, sports fees arrived seasonally, school trips required deposits. The household managed these costs by adjusting within its limits. There was no sudden crisis. There was also no sudden abundance. The job continued to anchor the household's insurance. That anchor grew heavier as the children reached ages where injuries and illnesses became more complex. Emergency room visits happened. Specialists were consulted. The coverage absorbed these events with minimal disruption. Each time, the relief was immediate and tangible. Career conversations happened less frequently. When they did, they stayed abstract. Phrases like maybe someday were used without intent. The day-to-day demands of work and family left little space for imagining different arrangements. The existing structure filled that space completely. The mortgage balance declined steadily. Equity grew quietly. The house aged alongside the family. Maintenance became routine. The job's income supported this progression without strain. There was a sense of keeping up, of not falling behind. Colleagues aged too, hair grayed, knees stiffened, conversations shifted toward health and retirement rather than ambition. The benefits package remained a central topic. Changes were discussed carefully. Everyone tracked their own exposure to risk. The job's salary, once adequate, began to feel less aligned with the cost of everything else. Groceries rose in price. Utilities crept upward. Insurance premiums outside of health increased. The paycheck still arrived on schedule, but its reach shortened. Adjustments were made quietly, often by delaying or declining things rather than cutting them explicitly. There was no single moment when the cost of staying became visible. It accumulated in small differences that were easy to ignore individually. A friend bought a larger home. Another paid off student loans earlier. Someone else took a sabbatical. These stories were heard without envy, filtered through the knowledge that their paths included risks that had been avoided. The job's benefits were renewed annually. Each renewal brought a thick packet of information that was skimmed more than read. The key numbers were noted, the rest blended together. The plan remained familiar enough to trust. As the children approached college age, new numbers entered the household's awareness. Tuition figures appeared in conversations. Savings were reviewed. The job salary, steady but limited, set clear constraints. Those constraints were accepted as facts rather than problems to solve. The workplace offered no surprises. Promotions were rare and often lateral. Leadership roles were filled from within a small circle. The path upward existed but moved slowly. The job rewarded endurance more than initiative. Health events continued to shape decisions. A parent needed care. Appointments multiplied. Time off was required. The job accommodated these needs without resistance. That accommodation reinforced the sense that leaving would introduce unnecessary difficulty. The household's financial picture remained orderly. There was no debt beyond the mortgage. Credit cards were paid monthly. Retirement contributions were made consistently, though not aggressively. The future appeared manageable, if not expansive. There were moments of quiet calculation, usually late at night, when the difference between current earnings and potential earnings elsewhere became apparent. Those calculations stayed theoretical. They did not account for the insurance, the flexibility, the known quantities that filled the margins of daily life. The job's stability shaped identity in subtle ways. Introductions included the company name. Social circles overlapped with colleagues. The routine became part of how time itself was experienced. Weeks followed a predictable rhythm. As years accumulated, the resume grew longer, but not broader. Skills deepened within a narrow range. The outside market shifted. New tools became standard elsewhere. Inside the building, adoption was slower. Familiar systems remained in place because they worked well enough. When layoffs happened in other companies, news traveled quickly. Each headline reinforced the choice to stay. Each story of lost coverage underscored the value of continuity. The job felt like a shelter that did not need to be tested. The children left for college. The house grew quieter. Expenses shifted rather than disappeared. Tuition payments replaced activity fees. Travel costs appeared. The job's income stretched to meet these demands, but only just. At work, younger employees arrived again, repeating a cycle that had become recognizable. They stayed briefly, then moved on. Their departures left no gaps in the system. The work adapted without effort. The benefits package became more complex as age increased. Health screenings multiplied. Medications became regular. The plan covered them with increasing importance. The job's value felt concentrated in this area, even as other aspects faded into the background. Retirement projections were reviewed periodically. The numbers were sufficient but unremarkable. They reflected decades of steady contributions rather than growth. The job had supported consistency more than acceleration. There was no regret exactly. There was also no sense of having explored the full range of possibilities. The path taken had been narrow by design. That narrowness had protected the household from certain shocks. It had also limited exposure to certain gains. The job continued. The badge continued to work. The parking spot remained available. The paycheck arrived on schedule. The benefits remained in place, quietly doing their work. The cost of staying did not announce itself. It lived in comparisons that were never made directly, in skills that were never tested elsewhere, in income that plateaued while the world moved on. It existed alongside real advantages that had been felt and used. Life went on inside this arrangement. Holidays were celebrated, repairs were made, health events were managed. The structure held. Nothing collapsed, nothing surged. The outcome unfolded exactly as it had been allowed to, shaped by a decision that had never felt dramatic enough to reconsider. The job remained what it had always been: dependable, containing, and sufficient.